Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing CSS selectors and going over how we can be more specific with what elements we select. So here we have a HTML file, and it's pretty simple. So at the top, we have a top-level heading that is an H1, and you can see it over here in the output. We also have a section with a section heading, which is an H2, and a paragraph section paragraph. You can see that in the output in the middle here. And then we have a footer as well. It also has an H2 and a paragraph, and we can see those down here at the bottom of the output. And finally, we linked a CSS style sheet via the head with this link tag to styles.css. So let's go ahead and open up that CSS file, and we can start working. So first of all, let's look at the most basic selector we can have, and that is a type selector, which just allows you to choose what type of element you want, so what tag you want to select. For example, we can say H1, and do color red, and now you'll see the top level heading becomes red because we selected it via the H1 type selector. Additionally, we can select multiple elements this way by simply separating them with a comma. So we could say H1, H2, and now we see the headings are all red. So all of the headings, because we selected H1s and H2s, and all of the headings on the page are either an H1 or an H2, we end up applying these styles to them. Now, this isn't limited just to similar elements like headings here. We could also say maybe H1, paragraph, and now we see the top level heading is red as well as the paragraphs. And then if we did want to just select absolutely everything, there's also a generic selector. So that is just the asterisk or the star. This is called the universal selector, and you can see it selects literally every element on the page, so everything is red. However, I usually would not recommend using this universal selector, the reason being it usually selects more than you want. So for example, in this case, it is selecting everything on the page, which is maybe what we want. But if we go back to our HTML, it's literally selecting every tag on here. So it's selecting the head, it's selecting the title, and this link tag, for instance. And we don't need to make those red. That doesn't do anything. So it's just sort of inefficient. It's adding styles in places we don't need. So usually I would recommend not using it, but occasionally there are use cases, so it's good to know that it's there. But now, what if we wanted to be a little bit more specific? So maybe we wanted to select the H1 and then we wanted to select the section paragraph. How could we go about doing that? Well, there's a few different ways, but I think by far the easiest and most common is by using CSS classes or HTML class attributes. So in HTML, we can come over here, and if we wanted to select the H1, first of all, we'd give it a class, and let's call it red. So the class attribute is an attribute that you can add to any element in HTML, and this is sort of just a generic way to select everything at once that has that class. So we can say this H1, and maybe we want the section paragraph, for instance, and we can say class equals red here as well. Go ahead and save that, and now in our styles.css, instead of using the universal selector, we'll switch to a class selector, which uses the period and then the name of the class. So we want period red, and that will make the top level heading as well as the section heading turn red. And we can combine the different types of selectors using the comma separated list. So for instance, we could do this as well as H2, and now you'll see everything's red except for the footer paragraph because that's the only thing that isn't meeting one of these two criteria. Okay, but now what if we wanted to be even more specific? For instance, what if we wanted to just make one single element red? Maybe we want only the section paragraph to be red and nothing else. Well, we could give it a class of red, so we could get rid of this class, and then we could come back here and get rid of the H2, and that's going to accomplish what we want, but it's probably not the best thing to have classes that only exist once. So alternatively, what we can use is the ID attribute, and this is the same attribute that we've seen for a while. We've seen this in HTML for label tags, for instance, use the ID attribute to link themselves to whatever they are labeling. But here we can use it just to provide a unique identifier to, in this case, this section paragraph. And I'll go ahead and save this, and in the styles.css, this is no longer a class, so we'll remove the period. And for an ID, we use the pound sign, so we can say £sign red, and we can go ahead and make that section paragraph red. And then we could do something like adding another rule set. So maybe we want to also make the H1 color blue. And now you'll see we can sort of mix and match what types of selectors we're using for what we want to select and where. And these are the main selectors you'll see. It's pretty straightforward. We tend to most of the time use a lot of type selectors and a lot of class selectors, and then sporadically we'll use some IDs, but there are other types of selectors and we'll go through those now. However, just know that what we've seen so far is what you will likely use 90+% of the time. So let's go back to our HTML and let's add a link. So inside of this section, I'll go ahead and add an anchor tag and let's make this a link to Algo Expert. So we'll say algoexpert.io and we'll say Algo Expert. Save that, and now we get this link to Algo Expert on the page. But what if we wanted to make this link styled specifically, and maybe there was another link somewhere? So maybe this one goes to systemsexpert.io and systems expert. Okay. So now we have a link to systems expert and Algo Expert. But what if we wanted to style the links? So we can style the links with the A tag, right? So we can say A, and then we want the anchor tags to maybe be color of green. And now the links are green, but what if we wanted this to only affect certain links? Maybe we only want to affect the Algo Expert link. And one way we could do this is by adding an ID or a class to the Algo Expert link. But another option here is to use an attribute selector. So we can use this by adding these brackets. So this can go next to the name of the type. Alternatively, it can actually go by itself, but we'll do it with the name of the type. And we'll go ahead and say the href attribute, so the hypertext reference. So this is the link. And we want this to be equal to, and then we can set some value. So in this case, we want it to be equal to algoexpert.io. Save that, and now you can see our style is only affecting the Algo Expert link. Now, most of the time with attribute selectors, this is all we need. We just need to say we have some attribute and we want to select some value for it. So in this case, we're selecting links with the attribute of href with algoexpert.io, but sometimes we do want to be even more specific with this. So for example, what if we had another link that also goes to Algo Expert, but this one goes to the product page specifically? And if we do this, now you'll see this one is blue. It's not getting the green text. And the reason for that is its link is not algoexpert.io. It's algoexpert.io / and then product. So the way we can actually fix this is before the equal sign, we can add the little caret. What this says is don't just select algoexpert.io. Instead, select anything that starts with algoexpert.io. So when I go ahead and save this, you'll see it selects both of the Algo Expert links. So both the link that is just Algo Expert as well as the one that ends with something else. But the Systems Expert link will not be selected because it is just a different link. It doesn't match the pattern that we set here. And again, we don't actually need the A here, so we can go ahead and get rid of this and nothing will change. So this would also select any other type of element that has the href attribute set to algoexpert.io. So usually we're a little bit more specific here and we set the type and then the attribute, but sometimes we can just do just the attribute if maybe you wanted to select all of the tags on the page that are disabled, for example. Finally, I want to go back to what we said about using classes and sort of revisit the way we did that. So the classes work, right? It allows us to select more specific elements, but you could imagine in some scenarios that would get overwhelming. You would end up adding classes everywhere, and we don't want to do this. It's good in some scenarios, but in some scenarios, we want something easier to select elements with that all follow some criteria. And the way we can do this is what's called a combinator. And combinators are selectors that use the context of the element in the DOM to decide whether or not it should be selected. And the most basic one of these will select children. So what I'll go ahead and do to make this a little bit easier to look at, let's go ahead and remove these up here. And when I save, you'll see the only styles we have left are the ones selecting the links. So now, what if we wanted to select this section paragraph, but we don't want to select the footer paragraph? So if I just did the P tag and then do color red, you'll see it selects both of them, but all I wanted was this footer paragraph. And the way we can do this is through one of the more basic combinators. And what that is the descendant combinator. So before the P tag, we can add the footer tag. And what this says is look for footers and then look for paragraphs inside of footers. So now I'll go ahead and save this, and only the paragraph inside of a footer is being selected. And we could actually get even more specific with this. So let's go back to our HTML again, and let's add a little bit more code inside of this footer. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a div just for the purpose of demonstration. And then inside of this div, I'll say div paragraph. And now when I save it, you'll see both of these are red, and maybe this is what we want, maybe it's not what we want. But if it wasn't what we want and we only want the direct children, so only paragraphs that are directly inside of the footer, whereas this one is inside of the div, which is inside of the footer, then what we can do is we can go back to the CSS and we can add a greater than sign here. And this is known as a child selector. So I can go ahead and save, and you'll see now we are only selecting the footer paragraph because it is the only paragraph that is directly inside of the footer. Now, the final set of selectors that I want to show are called sibling selectors. So let's go back to the HTML. The idea of a sibling is it's any elements that share the same parent. So for example, all 5 of these elements could be considered siblings. And then an adjacent sibling are siblings that are directly next to each other. So for example, these 2 elements, so the heading and the paragraph, are adjacent siblings. But this H2 and one of these links is not an adjacent sibling because there's an element in between them. And we can select for both of these things. So for example, let's go back to our styles.css, and maybe instead of this footer paragraph, so I'll get rid of that. And now what we can do instead is do something like H2, and then we use the tilde and a paragraph. And what this says is get any paragraph that is a sibling of an H2. And if we go back to the HTML here, you'll see we have this paragraph up here is a sibling of an H2, as well as this paragraph down here. And for example, we could change this. So I'll go ahead and get rid of this for a moment. And we can change this to be a anchor tag that is a sibling of an H2. And you'll see now all 3 of these are red. However, if we wanted just adjacent siblings, what we could do is add the plus sign instead of the tilde. And what this will do is only get the adjacent siblings. And you'll see now if we go back to the HTML, these anchor tags are not adjacent to this H2. However, if we comment out this paragraph, you'll see the first one becomes red, whereas the other links are still blue. The reason being the systems expert link is adjacent to the H2. However, these 2 links, while they are siblings, they're not adjacent siblings, so they don't get selected. That's going to be the final CSS selector we'll look at for now, and that should cover the vast majority of the selectors that you'll ever see, and most selectors from here simply become combinations of the selectors we've seen so far and more complex versions of them, but it should all sort of stem from what we've seen here. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.